I will be talking about basically two things that had to do both with the relationship between Anatolian and Indo-European languages and Ugaritic, but they sort of the two things sort of interconnect, and they both have to do with borrowings of stop consonants. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the rendering of stop consonants from Anatolian languages when these stop consonants are borrowed into Ugaritic, the substitution rules, and what they can tell us about what these stop consonants were actually like in Anatolian, and what that may mean for Indo-European phonology, early Indo-European phonology. And then I'll go more straight into the Semitic stuff and talk about two examples of such borrowings from Hittite-Alluvian Anatolian languages into Ugaritic, which I've suggested myself. So, and look at how those two possible loans factor into this question of rendering of stop consonants. And I've come up with this very, very smart title, Stop Borrowing, which I felt very smug about. So without further ado, let's start by taking a look at the Indo-European stop system and its reconstruction, which is a very thorny issue and has been for many, many years. The classical reconstruction in Indo-European studies is that there are basically three variants of every stop, which are traditionally reconstructed as a tenuis, an unvoiced stop, a voiced stop, a media, and a media aspirata, which is normally traditionally regarded as being some sort of either an aspirate or more probably a breathy stop. So in the case of dentals, we would have d, which is what you have on the screen right now.
Sorry to interrupt, Ola. Could you put presentation mode on?
Yeah,
it's a bit bigger then.
Yeah. Better?
It takes a second to load for us, I think. Not seeing any difference yet. No, we don't see a change.
Okay. I'll see
maybe you can just zoom in. Otherwise,
so you can check it up here.
Yeah, it's black right now.
Screen.
Oh, yeah, right. This is the beautiful.
Oh, this is beautiful. This is weird.
On a beam effect we get.
Yeah.
And then if you go full screen.
Now I have full screen.
Perfect. Thanks.
Does this look good?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, there you see the three traditionally reconstructed variants: the, and the, a tenuis, a media, and a media aspirata. And this system was reconstructed originally on the basis of, first on the basis of Sanskrit, but Sanskrit has four of them. As some of you may know, Sanskrit has a tenuis aspirata too, a t. But then it could be shown that this t or k, the unvoiced aspirate, was secondary and was not there in the Indo-European proto-language. So one ended up with these three: d, 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 g, g, g. The problem with this is that it's a very, very typologically weird system, and it's been claimed that there is no such language on the face of the earth. There is, it turned out, but it's very, very rare. So it has been reinterpreted in various ways. And one of the most common ways of reinterpreting this system, which has been known in various forms as the glottalic theory, is to reinterpret at least the medii, that is the traditional simple voiced sounds, as glottalized in some way. And in the modern versions of this theory, which you can find in Alvin Klukost, for example, which you have at the bottom of the screen, you reinterpret the medii as pre-glottalized. So, duh. Klukost goes even further. He argues, based on Fredrik Kortland, that the tenuis were actually long or geminate stops, and then the medii were pre-glottalized, and the medii aspirata were just simple stops. So he ends up with a very different system with d, d, and t, which is very, very different from the way these sounds were traditionally reconstructed. And there's an ongoing debate in Indo-European studies as to whether or not this type of radical revisionist scenario is correct or not. The main piece of data for this idea of the tenuis, the simple unaspirated stop being a geminate comes from Anatolian, that is from, say, Hittite or Luwian, because it is a fact that in Hittite and Luwian, cuneiform Luwian, the etymological tenues are written as geminates. Whatever that means, there's a debate about that. What does this really mean? But they're written as geminates, and there's no specific marking suggesting voice in and of itself. The voiced cuneiform signs, so to speak, aren't used contrastively for this contrast at all. So that's why Klukost and others have argued that voice wasn't at all a phonemic phenomenon in early Anatolian, and indeed not in Indo-European at all. At first, Klukost even said that voice was totally absent. Then he admitted that it was probably there allophonically, which we'll look at. So for the various Indo-European subfamilies, we have various types of evidence for how these various sounds were pronounced. Latin and Baltic and perhaps Anatolian do seem to suggest pre-glottalized medii, which is, I'll give one example of why. It's because in Latin, if you have a media consonant followed by another consonant, it lengthens a previous vowel. The classic example is the verb ago, which in the participle is arctus, not actus, but arctus. And this has been interpreted as a remnant of a pre-glottalization, so something like actos. And there are similar phenomena in Baltic and perhaps Anatolian. At the same time, Indo-Aryan suggests, and Greek suggests some type of aspiration for the mediae aspiratae. That's the d, or in Greek t. Latin perhaps suggests that too, because Latin makes these sounds into fricatives, which would be easier to explain if there was aspiration of some sort. Quote, aspiration, unquote, because breathy voice isn't really aspiration, but it's been interpreted as that. And then, like I told you, Anatolian seems perhaps to suggest that the tenues were long in some way, because they're written as geminates in Anatolian. One may also note with some interest that gemination in other cases is rare or absent in Indo-European, in early Indo-European, which would fit well with the idea that gemination was actually a characteristic of a type of phoneme, not something that could freely occur. Now we come to the Northwest Semitic loan evidence. And what that tells us, especially Ugaritic, is that in Ugaritic loans, the historical medii and medii aspiratae, the d and d in the classical view, intervocalically, they almost always appear as voiced sounds, whereas the, quote, geminates, unquote, in Anatolian are rendered as unvoiced. And I have some examples here. There are many others. We have the Ugaritic word ptr, meaning probably something like basket, from Hittite pattar, notice the geminate. We have the word zitr, which I'll return to later, which I argue is from Luwian zittar, also with a geminate. But then we have the Hittite Luwian upati with single stops, which is rendered in, it means land grant, which is rendered into Ugaritic as ubdi, ubadia, ubadiu, with voiced stops. And we have a number of others which fit perfectly with this. For example, the name of the Hittite king, Supiluluma, who is rendered Thupiluluma, with an unvoiced P. And possibly even Hebrew Tawech or Toch, which has been suggested to be from Hittite Tweka, with a geminate. So in Northwest Semitic loans, it does look as though the historical medii and medii aspiratae appear intervocalically as voiced. And Joel Shimon, I have the reference there, has many more examples of this. So they do, the historical medii and medii aspiratae have something voice-like in common. Also in Anatolian, these two categories fall together, and they wouldn't do that unless they had something in common. And what is that something? Well, in Ugaritic and other Northwest Semitic loans, this something, at least intervocalically, does seem like voice. And that in fact is why Klukost later admitted that intervocalically there was at least allophonic voicing of these sounds, even though he doesn't like voicing as a phonetic trait. The gemination of the unvoiced stops is suggested by a number of things. The first thing, Klukas has a number of arguments. One of them is the so-called Chop's law, which says in Luwian that in the first, if you have an initial stressed syllable with an a short that turns into a followed by a geminate. And this happens to these stops as well. So they behave there as geminates. Another one is the word essi, meaning thou art, you are, which in Hittite has two s sounds, sc, whereas the other Indo-European languages simply have a single s here, Sanskrit assi, for example, not assi, but assi. And he interprets this as a sign that the other Indo-European languages degeminated all geminates. Of course, as been pointed out by numerous scholars, this could just be a matter of analogy, so it doesn't say that much. It's been argued that these geminates actually close syllables, which is debatable, but still, some sort of length is not improbable. And it's not improbable that length would be in complementary distribution with voice. We find something similar in Tamil, for example, where you have geminates appearing as unvoiced intervocalically, whereas non-geminates get voiced. Hurrian seems to do the same thing. Old Japanese had something similar, even though it hadn't really started creating geminates yet, but it still has this intervocalic voicing, and there are many, many other typological examples of this. So possible model for Proto-Indo-European would be to say that this is a sort of chicken and egg problem, and this is the way I analyze it myself, to say that none of the sounds were phonemically voiced, but that the medii were creaky voiced or preglottalized, and that the medii aspiratae were breathy. So none of them had normal modal voice, but two of them had something voice-y, so that we would get one long sound, one creaky sound, or preglottalized sound, and one breathy sound. And this would mean that voice, which later became the distinguishing thing in many Indo-European languages, would be a sort of meta-analyzed phenomenon. And I would like to draw this parallel to how the dagesh works in Tiberian Hebrew. Jeffrey Kahn has pointed out that the dagesh shows what he calls increased strength or increased muscular pressure, which is a sort of meta-phenomenon combining both gemination in that case and non-fricativization of the Beged Kefat letters. So it doesn't really show one phonematic trait, it shows a sort of meta-analyzed one. The system I've shown here would be typologically rare, but something vaguely similar does occur in Clausa. So that's the one I'm working with anyway, because it would explain all the data and it would explain why categories 2 and 3 here appear as voiced in some way, even though they apparently weren't characterized by normal modal voice originally. Okay, the problem then becomes initial voiced and unvoiced stops, because it's been suggested by Craig Melchett and others that in Anatolian, initial stops were unmarked for voice, that what he calls voice, that whatever that was, that the voiced and unvoiced categories fell together. So I'm going to look at some examples, and here on the screen we have some examples of loans into Ugaritic which do seem to suggest an inherited voice contrast initially. We have the smoke word, drith, which almost everybody agrees is from Hittite duchuis, but the Proto-Indo-European root is duch, with a voiced aspirate, so there the voice would fit. We have the personal name Trndis, which is probably from the name of the storm god, Tarchun or Tarchunt, the conqueror, which is from an Indo-European root with an unvoiced sound, Tarchu. So there the T would fit, the unvoiced sound would fit. And possibly the well-known divine name Dagan, if from the Indo-European Dagon, meaning earth. This has been argued by, among others, Itamar Singer, and with some hesitation, myself. So these three words would fit with an inherited voice contrast, but being represented in the Ugaritic loans. But we have some less easy cases, and these now we come to my own suggestions. One of them is the word written grdish in Ugaritic, and it's from the epic of Kirta. And it talks. The text here talks about King Kirta's line being destroyed. And this word grdish, which you can find in these two examples, are used to describe the erosion or destroying of his heritage or house. And this word is etymologically obscure. You find it in the last lines in both of these quotes. The usual attitude is to explain it from the Syriac word gardesh, erode or gnaw, which is a very, very rare word, mostly attested in lexicographical sources, and it means breaking bones and gnawing them to extract the marrow, which doesn't fit super well with the description of a royal house getting destroyed. So I'm not totally sold on that. There was an early suggestion by Virulot to derive it from the Hittite word kurtas. The S there is the nominative ending, which would mean fortress or citadel. And because of the semantics, that has mostly fallen by the wayside. And it should be noted too that the G at the beginning of this word kurtash doesn't say anything about the voicedness, because like I mentioned, the Anatolian languages don't distinguish between the quote voiced and unvoiced sounds. It could as well have been spelled with a K, so to speak. But in 2016, Joel Simon suggested that this Hittite kurta is not at all, normally it's explained as an Old Indo-European word meaning citadel or city or high place, grdor, gorto. But he argued that it's not. He argued that it's from quirto, cut off, because the traditional etymology of that word doesn't really work with the sound laws. So he argued that kurta in Hittite does not mean etymologically mean high place, but that it means separated place. And then Virulot's suggestion merits resurrecting, because Kirta then is the cut off one. And Greenstein has suggested that even Kirta's name suggests this, that Kirta is karitu, he is cut off because he doesn't have any heritage. And if we look at this word gurdish as a G passive form, as does Budroyan Padi, a form gurdasha, it would fit very, very well indeed with a borrowed form from gurtas. And also note the beautiful assonance between the then inherited krt, the Semitic word, and a borrowed Indo-European word beginning with grd, both meaning something like cut off. This would be very interesting indeed. But the question is then, is this etymology of kurta correct? Well, if we look at two places, classical cases of this word being used, it doesn't just seem like any old city. Look at this one, the Annals of Mursili. Nukan astata chaperi sarapau nukurtan serwetenun namatutsias asandulat epun. And I went up to the town of Astata and I built a gurta up there and I manned it with a garrison of troops. So it seems like something more cut off than just a city or a citadel. And even better, from the deeds of Supiluluma. Siunas quid nachans estan ustaratsi curti shakupabo salama natta quinquitarnas. Since my father feared the gods, he did not let anyone into the upper gurta of Kubaba and the tutelary god. So the gurta in this Hittite text seems not just like any old city or city district, but as a cut-off corpus separatum, a cut-off precinct, which would fit extremely well with Simon's suggested etymology, that the word etymologically in Hittite means an area cut off. We have other words from the same root, quer, meaning geographic cut-off precincts, like Luvian Kursawar, island, Hittite quera, field, and there's another kurta word in Hittite meaning something like writing tablet, which would then show that quirto, the cut-off bit, could appear like that in Hittite. Then it would be in the sense of a writing tablet being cut off or perhaps cut into. So all of this suggests that Shimon might be quite right, that the Hittite word kurta does not simply mean citadel, but a cut-off precinct. And if that is so, and this word appears in the Kirta text, we get a somewhat different translation. Kirta, his line is destroyed. His heritage is like a place cut off. He saw his line destroyed, his dwelling wholly like a place cut off. And note that if we were simply to use the traditional Syriac etymology for this grdish, the gender concord would be off, because in the last line here, thubtu, ma'da gurdasha thubtihu, thubtuhu is actually a feminine word, which would fit quite bad indeed with a masculine word. But a borrowed, weird, nouny word would fit rather well. And finally, we have this word tzitr, which occurs in the Epic of Akhat, in the famous list of filial duties, the duties of the ideal son. What the son is to do when his father dies. The ideal son is to put up a stele for his fatherhood, Matsibusakini il Ibihu, and he's to do this in the Kudshi, tzitr, whatever tzitr is. And it's been suggested that it means something like time, as in the plant, or that it means sun disk, which for various reasons it cannot. I have this idea that it's from Luwian, unattested by completely regular word tsitar, thing lying down, act of lying down. The root tsi in Luwian means to lie down. And then, in that case, tsitar would mean either a lying offering, as opposed to a stele in the previous line, or a sanctuary of the lying down, which would fit with a mortuary sanctuary when the old father has passed on. So that's why I argue that this word is in fact an abstract, borrowed Luwian abstract noun, tsitar, meaning thing lying down. Why then is it spelled with a z and not with, as we've seen, the other affricate sound, affricate signs? This ties together with what we heard in previous presentations, of course, with the affricate theory and things. And I think that's because the Akhat epic was probably fixated at a time when the sound written with a samech, so to speak, had started to become deaffricated, but the weird S with a grave accent sound had not become regular yet to render ts. So they had to use what they had left, namely the Z sign. So the use of that says nothing about the voicedness of the initial consonant. And there we come back to what we talked about at the beginning. If these two loans are correct, do they say anything about the preservation of voice, or etymological voice initially in Anatolian words? Well, they give no, in one case, it seemingly falsifies such a correlation, because if gurdasha is from a word etymologically in Indo-European being quirto, the voicing doesn't match. And this tsitar word at least gives no positive evidence for a match. And all this in voicing at the beginning of words. And all this would mean that Melchit's idea of voicedness being unimportant or unmarked, unimportant at the beginning of Anatolian words does seem to be correct. It does seem to be just an archiphoneme there. There seems to be no difference between gurto and gurto. So if these two loans are correct, if I've interpreted them correctly, it suggests that the other cases in which there was a matchup between the etymological voicing in the Indo-European word and the voicing in the Ugaritic loan is just due to chance. And these two words wouldn't support this, and thus it supports Melchit's idea of voice being non-phonemic at the beginning of Anatolian words. Also, this it's worth remembering that mechanical substitution rules aren't always perfect. If we look again at this perfume, smoke, incense word, we see that the medial consonant is rendered as a rayin, even though it does have a geminate ch in the Hittite word, which it ideally shouldn't if geminateness were totally correlated with non-voicedness and with voicelessness. So we have to remember that loan substitutions aren't always perfect, but again, it's suggestive in this case. So loan relationships between Anatolian and Northwest Semitic, Ugaritic in this case, they can be studied together, both for exegetical value to explicate a certain text, and then that can be used to illustrate phonological properties of the loan-giving language. And here we have some bibliography for this whole thing. But so, yeah, I do think Melchett is right. I do think initial stops were unmarked, had no marking either plus or minus for voice, but that other early pre-voice categories were represented